Hello, I am the High Apostate Phineas 12 Gauge, and welcome to the Apostate Seminary. This is a logic episode. Eventually I will go over why I pick on CreationWiki so much, but for now suffice it to say I could drive to them without refilling my gas tank. So today is going to be their interpretations of logical fallacies, and then what I think about those fallacies. So I will be drawing also on my copy of Patrick J. Hurley's A Concise Introduction to Logic textbook, and my lecture notes. These are things that, while it is CreationWiki and the local Creation Institute church place that maintains the wiki, these are all things that atheists, agnostics, and apostates from any religion see pretty frequently. One they don't touch on that I am going to cover is the tu quo qui fallacy, and part of that is just to explain the fact that it's not a fallacy I'm committing this episode, but it's also because it's something that we hear a lot. So all these views are mine. I'm not speaking to the atheist position. Generally, I'm speaking to logic. The only thing that atheists agree on is a lack of a god. And logic is an attempt to systematize human reasoning, which isn't perfect, especially when talking about fallacies, especially when talking about informal fallacies, which most of these will be. So CreationWiki starts off their article by saying that scientists commit a lot of fallacies in argumentation, and they're not specific about that. They also say that a hobbyist or layperson creationists make a lot of fallacies, but never quite put it together that the logic they're talking about is either philosophical or mathematical in nature, and scientific papers generally aren't argumentative in nature. Scientific papers lay out research, they lay out findings and interpretation, so it's not necessarily applicable to scientific papers. As evidence of this, they cite the required courses necessary to earn a PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology from USC in 2005 and point out that there's no philosophy or logic classes anywhere in the list of biology classes you have to take for your biology degree. Completely ignoring the fact that you will work with people who are majoring in a variety of fields, you get electives, their criteria may have changed in 15 years, there is a set of core classes that universities require you to take, but I don't expect them to know that. And also books exist. And books did exist in 2005. And I can see their point that an informal logic critical thinking class is useful, but it's not just useful for creationists and the biologists that for some reason they have a tremendous hard-on for. It's a skill set that's useful for everybody and should be taught in elementary to middle school. So as I said, most of these fallacies are going to be informal. Quick refresher or quick learn-ins for people who don't know. There are two aspects to an argument. There's the form, and then there is the truth value and substance of the argument. In a deductive argument, these are referred to as validity and soundness. Validity measures the truth value preservation of an argument, and that is solely a function of form. That comes up later. This is why a valid argument is one where a conclusion must be true if the premises are true. Soundness deals with the truth value of claims, and is a valid argument with all true premises. An inductive argument is measured in strength and cogency. A strong inductive argument is one that is probably true if all of the premises are true. A cogent argument is a strong argument with all true premises. Donald Trump is a lying piece of shit. Donald Trump is speaking, therefore Donald Trump is lying, would be a cogent argument. The substance of the argument is whether or not the things presented in the argument are actually true, and deal more with epistemology and how we know things and less how we reason our way from premises to conclusion. A fallacy can be either formal or informal, as I alluded to earlier. A formal fallacy deals with the form of the argument, and an informal fallacy does not. Fallacies just mean there is an error in reasoning preventing the conclusion from being acceptable as a statement that if the premises have truth value, then the conclusion will have the same amount of truth value or will be likely to have truth value. This doesn't mean that the conclusion or premises are strictly false if there is a fallacy, only that it demonstrates that the conclusion does not follow from those premises. There are a few ways to prove this, but the thing I want to get through is this. Despite what you see on Twitter, logical fallacies do not concern the truth value of a statement and only deal with the capacity for truth preservation. It is still possible to argue the facts even with a perfectly valid argument. For instance, if the world were flat, then the UN would be involved in a flat Earth cover-up. The world is flat. Therefore, the UN is involved in a flat Earth cover-up. This is, of course, not true, but it is valid. Because the argument is in the form modus ponens, and modus ponens is an argument form that we know is always valid by nature of that form. That's why it was named. If the premises were true, the argument would be both valid and sound. So moving on to the list. To kick off is mine. It's important to me that we cover tu quo qui. Tu quo qui is an appeal to hypocrisy and translates to you too. It looks like this. You shouldn't drive 100 miles an hour in a 25. It's dangerous. Well, you drive 100 miles an hour in a 35, so you don't get to say that. It's a form of whataboutism, and it's not being committed here in this episode, although at times it may look like it. The reason that I'm not committing it here is because there isn't an argument in this episode. It's all just definitional. It's me evaluating their definitions to line up a little more with what makes them a logical fallacy to begin with. This isn't saying that God doesn't exist for these reasons, and there's no fallacy being committed here, which is the fallacy of using the fact that your interlocutor committed a fallacy to try and invalidate their argument like a fucking jackass. And the reason that's not present here is because I'm not rebutting anything. So now I'm going to start their list, and that begins with an ad hominem fallacy, which they define as Latin to the man. It's an argument which attacks people holding a contrary view rather than attacking specific points regarding their view. Their example, I'm a creationist because I find flood, geology, irreducible complexity, and specified complexity to be convincing arguments. To which their secularist responds, but you're not a scientist, your opinions are invalid. So the secularist in this case has dismissed opinions on the basis of credentials without ever addressing the merits of the actual argument. This is wrong. An ad hominem fallacy is when you attack the person to demonstrate the wrongness of their claim rather than attacking their argument. George Pell is a cardinal, therefore he knows morality, according to the Bible, is a good argument. George Pell probably would know fairly well morality by divine command theory of what's written in the Bible. But if you dismiss it by saying George Pell is an unrepentant kidfucker so he doesn't know shit about morality, that would be an ad hominem attack because you aren't attacking whether or not he's an authority on biblical morality. You're just attacking him as your argument. The shorthand would be this. An ad hominem is telling someone they're wrong because they're an idiot. An argument and an insult is telling someone the why of why they're wrong and then calling them an idiot. An insult is just telling them they're an idiot. In their example, the person is attacking their interlocutor's credentials. That's fine. In a public debate, it would be encouraged to cast doubt on the eyes of the crowd. Best practice is to attack the person's credentials and then ask for a more qualified authority, which isn't represented here. Worst practices, and what they have listed is closer to a non sequitur as I read it. If the point of the secularist, they say evolutionist, I'm going to say secularist because it's closer to what they mean when they say evolutionist. If the point of the secularist is to use not a scientist as an insult, then fine, it's an ad hominem. But what's really going on there is, as I read it as charitably as I can, is that the secularist is simply telling the evolutionist that they need more information, they need a better source, they need a better authority, they need to move up the intellectual chain of command, as it were. That being said, it is tempting to dismiss appeals to authority as a logical fallacy, but it isn't always, and that's going to be one of the ones they list later. I'm doing this more or less in the order that they give them in, so for the moment, going to move on to overgeneralization. An overgeneralization is an argument which makes a statement so broad as to be classified as an exceeding the original point that was trying to be proved, says they. This sentence doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but also seems wrong. The example and explanation they give is the secularist says creationists aim to not only destroy science in an effort to bolster their claims, they mean to redefine the United States of America, eviscerate the Constitution, and effectively dismantle American democracy by instituting religious indoctrination in the schools and halls of public policymaking. They say he has generalized about the secret goals of all creationists to such a degree that apparently even little 11-year-olds reading the story of Noah and believing it are involved in this conspiracy to destroy the world. And those two things aren't connected. The example that they give and the assertion they make don't have anything to do with each other. This fantasy secularist of theirs is just making an assertion. A logical generalization is a form of inductive reasoning where you start at a specific and draw a conclusion about a group. If they said that their secularist asserted that because their dad wants to do those things and so all creationists do, that would be a hasty generalization or an overgeneralization and a weak induction because it moves from the specific to the general in a reckless way. There's not a big enough sample group to be representative. Interestingly, their little rebuttal about it is a straw man argument. They didn't say that the secularists they dreamed up said any of those things and then attacked them anyway. A straw man will also come up later. Next on their list is a non sequitur. They say a non sequitur is just an argument with conclusions that don't follow from the premises, which is true. Technically, all fallacies contain a non sequitur, and that's what makes them fallacies. If they weren't fallacious, the conclusion would follow from the premises. And then they have their secular chap say, as evidence for common descent, the structures that all known organisms use to perform these 4 basic processes are all quite similar, in spite of the odds. All known living things use polymers to perform these 4 basic functions. Organic chemists have synthesized hundreds of different polymers, yet the only ones used by life, irrespective of species, are polynucleotides, polypeptides, and polysaccharides. So there's no surprise here that they say the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises because it doesn't take into account that God could have done all that. The issue here is that I have to take an aside for begging the question on an example that wasn't necessary. Begging the question is a type of secular reasoning where the premise is as, or in this case is more, objectionable than the conclusion. The fallacy they've committed here is that in order for that to make sense, they have to demonstrate that God is more reasonable as an interloper than not as an interloper. What makes their argument that the fantasy secularist argument is bad is the fact that they have to demonstrate an indemonstrable extra step. Making it harder isn't the answer, especially when you can say that only shows that those 4 polymers are useful for survival in a certain environment, not that the life forms came from the same place. I think it's kind of a bitchy way to respond, but the other way requires a wizard friend. The example I would give could be space with other polymers on some other planet, and then science will move forward. It's just a better argument. They call the next one proof by authority. I usually call it an argument from authority, and it would be bitchy to argue over it. They define it as an argument which is based on a person's authority rather than on the merits of the authority's position. And that's a stupid definition. The argument they give, and the most basic part of their rebuttal, is the scientific consensus today is that evolution is science and creation is not. Therefore, evolution is the scientific position. He has argued that because most scientists think this way, it must be true. So why is that a bad definition? That's a bad definition because sometimes an appeal to an authority is a good thing. If I pretend that as an atheist I care about evolution anywhere near half as much as they want to pretend I do, and I invoke the authority of Richard Dawkins or Stephen Jay Gould, that's fine. That's a fine way to make a point. Those are both solid choice of biologists to lean on, and that's a good appeal to authority. Similarly, if I needed a Bible verse, calling Ken Ham's citation of the Bible would be a good appeal to authority, because when the Bible is the only book you're allowed to study, you probably learn some verses. William Lane Craig is probably a good appeal when you need to know about Kalam, and you know what? I bet those last 2 are done by the fine folks at Northwest Creation Network all the time. All that being said, asking my kid or my mom about evolutionary biology and then invoking them as an authority isn't a good move. They're not qualified authorities, which is what the fallacy really should be called. It should be called an appeal to a unqualified authority. Now, on another tangent, the idea that scientific consensus and most scientists think this way are the same is total bullshit. It's a false equivalency. A scientific consensus really doesn't have anything to do with the scientists because regardless of who does the experiment, if the findings are good, literally anybody will find them. What scientists report isn't what they made up or agreed upon or the party line. Northwest Creation Network seems to not be able to understand that scientists are reporting the data, and that's probably because they think the Bible has the answers. That's why they go after Darwin so hard. My family did it while I was growing up. Blah, 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 Darwin. Yeah, he was hugely foundational for modern biology, but he isn't the end-all be-all. Biology isn't just finding out ways to justify Darwin. There is no evolutionist Darwinian apologetics. There's just biology. Biology is because biology is true outside of the authorities you can appeal to. When you say Darwin says or Dawkins says, it's not the same as saying Elijah said or Paul said, because Darwin and Dawkins weren't chosen by biology to preach the good word of genetics. They can both fuck themselves off a cliff, and it won't matter because biology doesn't need to be justified. So the next one on their list is a proof by assertion. The example they give of this, rather than being an example of an argument from assertion, is a piece of an article taken out of context, clearly with the whole article on each side, that they then say is an argument and then shit on. Because of that, I'm just going to explain what an argument from assertion is. The argument from assertion takes the form of, if I'm right though, right? Right. Therefore, we agree, I'm right. Or as CreationWiki puts it, premise 1 is X is true, premise 2 is X is super true, premise 3 is X is totes true though, premise 666, so we agree X is true. It's very much an argument ad nauseum in which the same thing is said over and over again until the interlocutor loses any desire to continue the conversation, leaving the asshole some kind of losing but victorious in a weird fucking game that only they are playing. Moving on from there, circular reasoning. I'm kind of excited for this one. In this one, they don't understand what an argument is, what a premise is, what a conclusion is, or what carbon is. The definition that they give is a circular reasoning is any attempt to prove something by first asserting it and then trying to prove it through any number of intervening conditional statements. The problem here is that a conditional statement is an if-then statement when you're dealing with logic, and a conclusion can come first. So they basically said a modus ponens, which is if P then Q, P therefore Q, modus tollens, if P then Q, not Q, therefore not P, or a pure hypothetical syllogism, if P then Q, if Q then R, if P then R, arguments are bullshit if they state the conclusion first, and there is no reason you can't. They would know this if they had bothered to take a philosophy or logic class. Socrates was mortal. If Socrates was a man, then Socrates was mortal. Socrates was a man. And that is just as valid as if Socrates was a man, then Socrates was mortal. Socrates was a man, Socrates was mortal. Just because one is the conclusion first and it is then demonstrated by conditionals, it doesn't mean it's a fallacy. And the argument example they give also isn't fallacious. The Earth cannot be merely 6,000 years old or 10,000, because we have found life forms that carbon-14 dating shows to be 40,000 years old. So the conditional here is, it's implied. We have to look for it, which, since this isn't sourced, means they probably didn't know they didn't put one in, or they don't know what a conditional is, which seems to be, a fair guess. If we grant them a conditional, which we should to be charitable, their argument would look like this. If there are things older than 6 to 10,000 years old, then the Earth must be 6 to 10,000 years old. Carbon-14 dating confirms that there are things that are 40,000 years old. The Earth must be older than 6 to 10,000 years old, and that is a perfectly valid argument. There's no fallacy there, and there's no circular reasoning because that isn't what those words mean. Circular reasoning is very specifically when your conclusion is one of your premises. The Earth must be older than 6 to 10,000 years old. Carbon-14 dating shows the Earth to be older than 6 to 10,000 years old. If there are things older than 6 to 10,000 years old, then the Earth must be older than 6 to 10,000 years. Carbon-14 dating confirms that there are things that are 40,000 years old. Conclusion, the Earth must be older than 6 to 10,000 years old. Or alternately, the Bible is true because it says it's true. It is God's word. We know it's God's word because the Bible says it. The Bible is true because the Bible says it's true. So on and so forth ad nauseum. Because in those, you're reasoning back to your conclusion. Now, the reason that doesn't happen in an if-then statement is because it is logically possible, dealing with the term in a philosophical jargon sense and not really in any tangible sense, for the Earth to be younger than 6 to 10,000 years old in that scenario. You may have to interact differently with the proposition, but if it is a necessary condition for the Earth to be under 10,000 years old, that there not be living things older than 10,000 years old, you can deny the sufficient condition to imply that the necessary condition can't be met and remain logically valid because, again, validity and fallacies only deal with the capacity for truth preservation in an argument and doesn't interact with the truth value of the statement. So why do they think that argument doesn't hold up? Quote, how do you know that? Your very model for dating depends on a certain isotope of carbon being in dynamic equilibrium in the atmosphere for a long time. Now, if the Earth were really as old as you say, that might be the case, but if it isn't, then your baseline unless your derived age for the sample are too high. That has nothing to do with fallacious argumentation. That's not an attack at the validity of the argument, which is what should be happening in a page on logical fallacies, since fallacies are about truth preservation and are functions of forms They are not about truth value. But while we're here, how do we know? A very quick rundown, link to a How Stuff Works page in the show notes. Carbon-14 is constantly decaying, and so when you die and quit taking in new carbon-14, the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12 changes. We can then use the carbon-12 measurement to measure against the carbon-14 to see how long you've been dead. So the question here is, how do we know how fast carbon-14 decays? It seems that we know that because we've seen it decay. So how can we rest assured that it is totally perfect and we can rely on it forever? I'm not going to claim we can, because science isn't about things that you can rely on forever and ever and ever. It's about being a process to find out the best information we can. So, for things that go back far, to be more accurate, we've actually started using potassium-argon dating for things going back further than the threshold that these creationists give, according to the Encyclopedia Britannica. And that brings us to a very important issue with their logic. Throughout history, what has disproved science has always been better science. Religion has never disproved science, and it happens a lot the other way around. So the fact that we found a better way to measure the rate of decay in something over time, and as such can determine the world is older than young Earth creationists say, or that we knew of previously, doesn't mean that science is always full of shit and you just get to make it up. It means, at worst, that scientist was a little wrong for a little while and better science came along to make it better. Their argument here seems to rely on the rate of decay waiting 100 years, and then all of a sudden accelerating in the rate of decay to cause us to think that it is decaying more slowly than it actually is. This would have to happen at a rate that makes it almost ridiculous to think that nobody would have noticed. It's kind of like trying to disprove evolution with super-evolution. It just doesn't make any sense. And the idea that if that were true, somehow it would demonstrate that evolution is false and their God exists just does not follow. It doesn't follow from that, and it doesn't follow from the fact that science will probably get better. That's the one note I want to leave this on. If we don't know, and we don't have it perfect, that doesn't mean that what you want to be right is. And the only thing that has ever proved science wrong is better science. But to be thematic, I think I'm going to go ahead and leave it on. Pointing out a logical fallacy does not mean that you're right. Knowing what they are if you're going to invoke them is important. Bad logic with true facts is better than great logic with no facts. I am the High Apostate Phineas 12 Gauge. Stay home, stay healthy, learn some logic.